there was the Secretary General to the United Nations 1992 Conference on the Environment and Development, the so-called Rio Earth Summit. Most of us heard about that at the time, but not in its full details. This is where Agenda 21, or Sustainable Development, was unveiled. And while doing so, Secretary General Strong said the following: current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class, that means average Americans, involving high meat intake, the use of fossil fuels, appliances, which means refrigeration, air conditioning, suburban housing, are not sustainable. Well, how could someone take that seriously? That's bizarre. If you don't take it seriously, you'll wake up one day and look at your hand and realize that you should have taken it seriously. What else is not sustainable under the terms of the Rio Accords and its sister document, the Global Biodiversity Assessment Report? In its own words, private property is not sustainable. Golf courses and ski lodges are not. Irrigation is not sustainable. Monotheism, commercial agriculture, and the family unit. Now, is the United Nations committed to the elimination of private property? Well, in 1976, at their Habitat 1 conference report, it was stated that, quote, private land ownership is also a principal instrument of wealth and therefore contributes to social injustice. Public control of land use is therefore indispensable. Well, oftentimes you get to that point where people say, all right, so the United Nations, which has no force and effect in the United States, has these crazy notions. Why should we be concerned? Well, here's why we ought to be concerned. In 1992, George Bush, then President George Bush, attended. Actually, he was parked in a yacht offshore of Rio de Janeiro, where he signed the Rio Accords and obligated the federal government to administratively implement these documents. Now, Congress never looked at it. The public never knew about it. But since then, federal agencies, all federal agencies, are designed around the concepts of sustainable development and their implementation within the United States. A year later, President Clinton, this is a bipartisan effort, established the President's Council for Sustainable Development. Now, that council had all of the environmental organization heads as part of it, and it had two business guys, Ken Lay of Enron and the chairman of California's Pacific Gas and Electric. Now, since then, the mayors, the county supervisors, and the governors have all adopted the principles of sustainable development, most of them not knowing what they're doing. There's a man named J. Gary Lawrence, who was an advisor to President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development. He was a U.S. delegate to the 1996 United Nations Habitat 2 Conference. He's director for the Center of Sustainable Communities up in the state of Washington, and he's a chief planner for the city of Sustainable Seattle. He said, participating in a UN-advocated planning process would very likely bring out many who would actively work to defeat any elected official who was undertaking local Agenda 21. So we call our processes something else, such as comprehensive planning. The state of Wisconsin is engaged in comprehensive planning. Growth management, or as California calls it, smart growth. And since he made these comments in 1998, other imaginative, warm and fuzzy terms have been adopted for implementing sustainable development or Agenda 21, including visioning, or common, or 2020, or community plan. Be wary of all these warm and other warm and fuzzy terms. You see, the land use element of sustainable development has two action plans. One is the Wildlands Project, which seeks the elimination of human presence on over 50% of the American landscape and heavily controlled activity on most of the rest of American land. and smart growth, which is dense human settlements subject to increasing controls on how we live and increasing restrictions on our mobility. In Santa Cruz, we have a 30-year-old two-lane freeway that needs to be substantially larger. The promise is always for widening the road. I've lived there for 20 years. The promise is always for widening the road. There's never the capacity to get that done. But instead, we're taking an antiquated old one-way, one-lane train track, spending tens of millions of dollars to acquire the right-of-way and hundreds of millions of dollars to build an infrastructure for the post-private property era. What we're doing is taxing ourselves into bankruptcy in order to put ourselves into smart growth cages. As to the Wildlands Project, the Department of Interior Bureau of Land Management has working papers from 1994. These papers are still the operating documents for that department. And they say that, quote, all ecosystem management, now that means the planet, should consider human beings as biological resources. I'll contend that the Education Department treats our children the same way. Smart growth means a new mobility, rails and trails. Doesn't that sound nice? We can all ride our bicycles, and we can get on slow-moving trains that take us to our predetermined destinations. And along those rail lines will be dense government-controlled real estate development. Compliant government partners or sustainable developers will do the business. Competition and free enterprise will be eliminated. Profits to these folks will be guaranteed, and the trains will run on time. This is a sign we're seeing increasingly, with increasing frequency around the country. Now, this particular sign comes on the other side of my town, La Selva Beach in Santa Cruz County, California. Now, the story on this is a sad one. Back in the 70s, the landowner, who was a bushberry farmer, found a unique salamander that he decided to take up to the new University of California at Santa Cruz. Well, immediately, the university went through the process and declared that salamander, a long-toed salamander, endangered. So the farmer was restricted from using his land. It was bought from him for pennies on a dollar. He went bankrupt and died. Well, the community thought, gee, we're getting a nice coastal hillside area. We can do some hiking. Not so. This property is only open to the sustainable developer federal agents. In the meantime, it's unmanaged. It's a fire trap ready to burn. And someone might presume that some salamander feels secure knowing that nobody will step on him. This map was compiled by a brilliant, brave gentleman in this audience. It was compiled from documents that were taken from Geneva just prior to the time the United States Senate was prepared to vote on the Global Biodiversity Treaty. This is in 1994. Because the Senate saw this map, and that treaty was ready to pass, but as the Senate saw this map, the treaty failed 94-0. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is it's being implemented anyway. Let me explain the map. The red sections are the wildland zones, to be devoid of human activity. That means recreational activity. It means all activities. That means that the natural materials, natural resources in those areas are unused by humankind. The yellow areas are areas for highly regulated activity. And you can see the little black dots. Those are the human settlements, or smart growth zones, where human beings are to be placed. The tool, you say, well, this is not possible. You know, this is not achievable, and that's certainly what I would have thought 5 years ago. But an array of tools have been used by the government agents for implementing this. Conservation easements, which transfer your property right to the government. You might still be able to use it under their blessing for a while, but a generation from now, that blessing will be gone, and those lands will be controlled.